Yeah, so we've got a slight change to our usual lineup this evening. I'm standing in for our usual host, John Parker, who is away at the moment. He's overseas. He's okay, I think, just having some connection issues and sending his apologies. So, your host this evening, I'm Emma Gill-Martin. I'm a senior technical officer here at the association, and I'm thrilled that I've got to stand in on such a great webinar. This is another in this series of our Wednesday webinars sponsored by Still. So they are free, but if you like what we do, please, we would love to have you as a member. Please do consider joining the association and supporting our tree care community. Tonight, if you do put something in the chat box, please do remember to select everyone, not just hosts and panelists, so that we can all see and enjoy your wonderful comments. And as always, we'd like your questions for speakers to go in the Q&A box. Thank you for your help with that. It helps us to manage questions at the end of the session. So what we're lacking tonight in the quality of the host is we are absolutely making up for in the quality of our two speakers. I'm so delighted to introduce you to Nadina Galle and to Justine Karst, two amazing powerhouses who've agreed to spend some of their time with us all. We're so very lucky. Nadina is an ecological engineer, a speaker and author of The Nature of Our Cities, whilst Justine Karst is a mycologist and, I hope you'd agree, a restoration ecologist from the University of Alberta. She's been making waves recently over the past couple of years, and I'm so excited for you to hear what she's got to say. Okay, what else do I need to tell you? CPD and CEUs. If you've requested a CPD certificate, look out for an email from us. Make sure to check your junk and spam folders before emailing. And CEUs, they are only available to live viewers, so you have needed to register your details in advance. We can't issue them retrospectively. Sorry about that. All right, let's get on with it, shall we? Justine is our speaker up first. Justine, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks so much for the invite to present to everyone tonight. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Justine, and I'll be talking to you about the Wood Wide Web. So I'm thinking probably most of you have heard something about the Wood Wide Web. It's one of those few concepts in ecology that have really come into mainstream, I would say. And so the Wood Wide Web, it's a story, and I would say it's a story that all trees in a forest are connected below ground through mycorrhizal fungi, and that through these fungi, resources, signals, information are transferred between trees. And through these fungal networks, mother trees recognize and warn their kin of danger. So this story has become very popular. So it's been featured in best-selling books like Finding the Mother Tree, The Hidden Life of Trees. You may have heard it on various podcasts. It's been featured in various newspapers, TED Talks, Ted Lasso, documentaries, and other fictional books like, say, The Overstory. I found some examples that are a little bit, I think, closer to home for most of you. So BBC featured the Wood Wide Web in one of their documentaries, Wild Isles. I think it came out about a year and a half ago. Various sort of videos, how trees talk to each other. And there's another one, how trees secretly talk to each other. And these have, each like millions of views. So the question is, though, is any of this true? So I am going to switch from using the name Wood Wide Web because this term is loaded with lots of functional implications that you will hopefully see by the end of this talk that are not necessarily supported by research. And instead, I'm going to use the term common mycorrhizal networks. And a common mycorrhizal network is formed when two plants, they could be the same or different species, they're connected below ground through these mycorrhizal fungi. But I want to be very clear in that I am not challenging the importance of mycorrhizal fungi to plants, trees. There is lots and lots of evidence to show that they are really important for nutrient acquisition, for, say, the trees, pathogen protection, all sorts of benefits. And mycorrhizal fungi, just to make sure everybody is on the same page. So these are fungi that colonize the fine root tips of trees and other plants. And what I'm focusing on, though, is asking questions about the functional importance of connections between trees through these fungal networks. So again, there's lots of evidence that mycorrhizal fungi are important to plants, but I'm asking questions about these common mycorrhizal networks. So about a year and a half, two of my colleagues, Jason Huxema and Melanie Jones, we published a review where we evaluated some of the popular claims that we are hearing in the media. And maybe like you, we thought some of these claims were extraordinary. And so we approached this review from a place of more like wondering if we were just behind in the research. And so we wanted to do a really deep dive to evaluate some of these popular claims. So the claims that we evaluated are that common mycorrhizal networks are widespread in forests, that resources are transferred through common mycorrhizal networks, and I'll abbreviate to CMNs, resulting in increased seedling performance, and that mature trees preferentially send resources warning signals to their young or kin through these common mycorrhizal networks. So the details of our evaluations are in this review paper that is posted on my slide. And I'm always happy, you email me, you want a copy of this because you can't get it. I'm always happy to send this out. And just know, yeah, the details are in the review paper, but I'm going to touch on some of the highlights that I want to share with you. So this first claim, common mycorrhizal networks are widespread in forests. And so I have this picture. It sort of represents trees connected below ground in something analogous to the internet, which is where the Wood Wide Web term came from, or this metaphor. And what's really challenging is when we're trying to directly observe these common mycorrhizal networks, fungi, the filaments are very thin, they're very fragile. So we can't dig in the soil to look at the common mycorrhizal network. Instead, we have to use indirect techniques. And one very common way that we do this is researchers will genotype trees, roots, fungi colonizing those roots, keep track of their locations. And from using that kind of tool, there's been these very nice maps developed. And I want to emphasize how much time and resources it takes to actually build these maps. So this is an example of one of them. Maybe you've seen something like this. So the green circles, these represent trees, trees of Douglas fir in this case. And then the black lines, these are trees linked by our particular fungal individual. So you can see some trees are, highly linked to other trees maybe not so much. And just to give you an idea of what is happening behind the scenes for these maps, like what are researchers doing? I have an analogy here. So this is a floor plan of someone's house. And if you could imagine that someone goes in and takes samples all over the house, in the kitchen, the bedroom, garage, or whatever else, and they're basically swabbing it for DNA. And in this example, they have found my DNA in the kitchen and in the living room. So one interpretation of this is that, well, okay, my DNA was found in the kitchen, in the living room, so my body must span the distance of those two locations. That is one interpretation. But you can see the distance between the kitchen and the living room on this floor plan is, over 10 feet. And so I'm only 5'6", and so there is no way that my body stretches that distance. So another interpretation of this map would be that at one point I was in the kitchen, I left some DNA, and another point I was in the living room and I left some DNA. And so my DNA is in two spots, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I span the distance of those 2 spots. So this is a limitation of these common mycorrhizal genotype maps. And so they are great as visual tools, and they are our gold standard right now for mapping common mycorrhizal networks. But different processes can give rise to the same pattern. And so what I mean by that is that this example, what I have here, so there's the initial CMN map of the representation of the forest. And then beside it, I have shown now 2 trees, and I've drawn on some little roots, and that big pink blob in the middle is, say, an individual fungus. So this is one interpretation, that these 2 trees are linked by a fungus that spans the whole distance between the trees. But there are other outcomes that are compatible with this map. So for example, here's another situation. I have 2 trees. Now I think I've drawn on roots that are probably a little bit more representative of what you would actually see in the field. And in this case, that pink genotype of fungus is found on one tree on the root system and then on another root system, but it's not connected. So these results are still compatible with the map, but it's not a common mycorrhizal network. So what this means is that, so these different processes give rise to the same pattern that are totally compatible with these maps. And the problem is with these links, the lines drawn on the maps, these fungal links, we don't know how long they persist to be functional. Do they last days? Do they last months? Do they last years? Are they eaten by nematodes? Are they disturbed in some way? These are all very natural processes that would break up those mycorrhizal links. The other problem, as I alluded to, it takes tremendous resources to build these maps, to go out in the field, to do all the sampling. It is a lot of work. And so not surprisingly, there are only 5 of these types of maps worldwide. They only include 2 different tree species of an estimated 70,000 tree species worldwide, and they also only include 3 fungal species. When we look at the total area mapped, so if we summed up the area across those 5 studies, it's equivalent to about 1 hectare of forest worldwide that has been mapped in this way, of about 4 billion hectares. So I'm not saying that we need to map 50% of the forest out there. It's just recognizing we have a very, very, very small slice of what these common mycorrhizal networks look like. And so to generalize across forests might be a little bit presumptuous at this point. So when I go back to this claim, so common mycorrhizal networks are widespread in forests, we would say the support is actually limited because we have so few of these maps. But what we do know is that these mycorrhizal networks, they should be present in the forest. So mycorrhizal fungi are often generalist in terms of which tree species they'll form associations with. We know that roots grow very, very close together. So it's possible, it's conceivable that trees should be connected below ground in the forest. So it's not that, I'm not saying that they don't exist, but we just don't have a good idea of the structure of these common mycorrhizal networks. Which trees are involved, which fungi are involved, are the links functional, how many trees are connected in a forest. So this next claim, so this is that resources are transferred through common mycorrhizal networks. And because of that, seedlings increase in their performance when they're plugged into this network. So there are 2 main experimental ways or experimental approaches that researchers tackle this question. And the first is using what we call natural barriers. So this is to assess if resources are flowing from one tree into another tree through a common mycorrhizal network. So on this slide, I have 2 seedlings, and they're labeled EM plants. So these are ectomycorrhizal plants. And then I have a AM plant. This is a plant that forms a different kinds of mycorrhizal, arbuscular mycorrhiza. The idea here is when you plant a seedling, and you label it with carbon dioxide so you can track where that carbon goes in the system. So the seedling will take up the carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. Carbon is going to go down through the leaves, stem, roots, and presumably if it's connected to another tree through this common mycorrhizal network, the carbon would move through the fungal hyphae and then end up in, say, the roots or shoots of the receiver plant. Using this method, because we have this AEM plant, what it is trying to control for is any carbon that moves in what we call the soil pathway. So this plant, this AEM plant, cannot form a network with the other plants because it forms a different kind of mycorrhizal association. So when we label the EM plant with our labeled carbon dioxide, if we find that any of the carbon ends up in our AM plant, then we would infer that the carbon is moving through the soil pathway, not through a fungal pathway. These are great experiments in that they allow seedlings to grow naturally, the roots intermingle and all that. But like all experiments, there's some limitations to our conclusions. So in this example, you'll see that the EM plants, they're connected by these purple fungi. So ectomycorrhizal fungi, compared to these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, they are very distinct morphologically. They grow a lot of hyphae in the soil. It's very dense in the soil compared to these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, where the hyphae, they're not as dense. They're just not sort of as thick in the soil. So what that means is, say, if you drop carbon into the soil, the ectomycorrhizal fungi are going to be able to take it up in greater amounts than the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So the problem with this is that when we're using an arbuscular mycorrhizal plant control for that soil pathway, it's likely or underestimating how much carbon is moving through that soil pathway. And what I mean by that is that so the carbon leaves the mycorrhizal root, it goes in the soil, and then it's picked up by another mycorrhizal root. So this is not flowing through a fungal network. So this is one limitation of this type of experiment, is that the way that this is set up, we could be underestimating how much carbon is going through that soil pathway. And we know from this other type of experiment, so this is where we use physical barriers. So here we have seedlings planted into 3 different kinds of treatment. We have seedlings just planted into the soil, that's on the left-hand side. So this seedling has access to common mycorrhizal networks. It's also going to be interacting with neighboring roots. The next one is a seedling planted into a mesh bag, and the mesh bag has small pores. But the pores in this case, they allow fungal hyphae to grow through the bag, but not roots. So this seedling in the middle can connect to the common mycorrhizal network, but it's protected from root interactions, neighboring root interactions. And then on the right-hand side is a seedling that's also planted in a mesh bag. And the pore size of this mesh bag is so small that fungi cannot grow in or out and roots cannot grow in out. So this seedling on the right-hand side cannot connect to a mycorrhizal network, and it also is protected from neighboring root interactions. So this is another design of how we can test whether there is resource flow between seedlings, connected or not connected. And we know from these studies, actually, that these mesh treatments, they had no significant effect on carbon transfer. And then another experiment, they showed that if anything, there was a small amount of carbon that was moving below ground, but it was in the absence of a common mycorrhizal network. It was actually moving through that soil pathway. So this same experimental approach of planting seedlings into mesh bags, which I will say we have done in my lab, there is other possible confounding effects when we're assessing its role, like whether a seedling can plug into this mycorrhizal network based on these mesh treatments. So I'm only just going to highlight one here, but in our review, we go through several other issues. So imagine that you plant a seedling in a pot, and if the pot is too small, it becomes root bound. So the seedling is not going to grow well because its roots are tight up against the pot. So they can't get enough nutrients, and they're really stuck in that pot. So now imagine that same seedling, the roots might not be root bound, but we have to think and consider the fungal hyphae extending from those roots. So if that pot is small, the fungal hyphae actually might get pot bound. And so when we're planting seedlings into these mesh bags in the field, one concern is that these mesh bags might be restricting the fungal hyphae that can't grow in or out of the bag. So it reduces the volume that these foraging fungi need to be gathering nutrients, say, for the plant. And so what this means is that it's a possible confounding effect. So here what I'm showing you, this is the results from a published experiment where they have assessed seedling survival, which is on the y-axis there, so 0 to 50%, as a function of the mesh size that they grew their seedlings in. So the very tiny mesh, the 0.5, so again, this does not allow a seedling to connect to the mycorrhizal fungi or interact with neighboring roots. And then as the mesh size increases to totally no mesh, the seedling has free access to be plugging into the mycorrhizal network and accessing neighboring roots. And so these authors interpreted their results as that seedling survival increases as seedlings have more access to common mycorrhizal networks. But what we argued is that there's this confounding effect that as the mesh size, as the pore size of those meshes increases, we're also expanding the volume for those foraging hyphae. So the seedling survival might increase because the fungi have more room to forage. It's a different interpretation. I'm not saying that one interpretation is more correct than the other. It's just the problem is that there are multiple interpretations, and there's no reason why we should go with one more than the other. So this would be a confounding effect that we want to eliminate before we make any inferences about how seedlings are doing as a function of attaching to mycorrhizal networks or in terms of resource transfer. So what we would say when we go back to this claim is that the support of this claim, we would say there's no consensus. And just a reminder that researchers in my field, we've been arguing about carbon transfer through mycorrhizal networks for 25 years. It has not been resolved. And so we are not the first to point out that this issue has not been resolved. But we did mention that there is these alternative explanations that need to be ruled out in our experiments. So what we do know is that resources can be transferred below ground in the absence of a common mycorrhizal network. It's only a tiny amount. I'm skeptical that it would even impact a recipient seedling, but there does seem to be a small amount that's moving below ground. And what we do know from our review is that there's actually approximately equal evidence that connecting to a putative CMN improves or inhibits seedling performance, but actually neutral effects are most common. And this again is detailed in our review. So the third claim that we evaluated, and I think this is the most extraordinary of all the claims, is that mature trees or mother trees can preferentially send resources or warning signals to their young through common mycorrhizal networks. And so this has received a lot of traction. So for example, this is an infographic put out by National Geographic. I know you can't see all the text, but what I want for you to notice is, number one, this is an old growth forest that is portrayed in this infographic. You can see the arrows. So this mature Douglas fir tree is sending resources or information through the mycorrhizal network to these other seedlings and to this birch. Over here, there's two pines, again, big pines in the forest, and they're signaling to one another because one is being attacked by insects. So when we went through the literature, there are no peer-reviewed published field studies testing this claim. We couldn't find any. And what we did find is that there are a couple experiments done in greenhouses where two seedlings are grown in a small pot. But when you drill down on those results, they actually don't support this idea that common mycorrhizal networks are moving these signals around. There's more details on that. But the important thing is what is happening to two seedlings growing in a small pot in a greenhouse. cannot be extrapolated to an old growth forest. There is just such a huge gap between what we do in a greenhouse experiment to what happens in an old growth forest. So when we go back and assess this claim, mature trees preferentially send resources, warning signals to their kin. So again, we could find no peer-reviewed published field studies to support or even test this idea. So weathering signaling occurs through CMNs among trees in a forest. It remains to be demonstrated. So putting these together, so evaluating these popular claims, we would say that the evidence is limited because we have so few maps of these common mycorrhizal networks in forest. We need to do more of these maps. That's a really, really critical component of this story, is just to understand the structure, because the structure of these CMNs will determine to some extent their functioning. Whether resources are transferred, resulting in increased seedling performance. This is inconclusive about the resource transfer. Often seedlings, they don't show a response to whether they can plug in or not. But keep in mind, there's a lot of confounding effects in these experiments that need to be dealt with before we can say anything with certainty. And then this final idea of mother trees warning their kin through common mycorrhizal networks, this one needs testing. So overall, we would say this story does not survive scientific scrutiny. So moving forward, so after our review came out, there was two others that came out, one in New Phytologist, another one in Trends in Plant Science. So these reviews were written by scientists totally independent of us, and they concluded many of the same things as we did in terms of there's just not a lot of evidence to support this story. There was a news brief in Nature magazine about this, sort of detailing the controversy and the debate. And what's actually really exciting for me is now more recently, there is new research coming out. This is really important because we wrote reviews, we looked at the past literature, but in any field, experiments done 25 years ago, we often improve on those techniques. So that is not unique to our field. This is what happens in science everywhere. And so what we really needed was new experiments to tackle some of these ideas, and accounting for some of the confounding effects, and then just also coming to the table with some fresh ideas. And that's what this particular study did. It's called Ectomycorrhizal fungi of Douglas fir retain newly assimilated carbon derived from neighboring European beech. And this study was really exciting because they very clearly showed that carbon from the donor seedling, it can go into the fungus, but it stays in the fungus. So when you look at the recipient seedlings, and they very carefully kind of cut things up, and they showed that that carbon stayed in the fungus and didn't go up to the shoot of the receiver. So again, this is exciting for me because I'm very interested in the new research that comes out on this topic. I would say for me, the main takeaways is that, so this wood wide web is a story ahead of the science. We need to do a lot more research to tackle some of these claims and probably be a little bit more skeptical about some of the claims coming up. Also, and this might be relevant to this audience, is that forest management decisions based on the existence of tree communication via these common mycorrhizal networks would not be supported by current research. And then finally, kind of stepping back and taking a wider view of this, is that promoting these false claims about forests as scientific, it may spur social action. So it may spur forest conservation, protection, but I believe it will erode the foundation of the scientific discipline. It's really important to tackle these misleading claims. So finally, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Melanie Jones and Jason Hoeksema. And I also want to point out that We did not have outside funding to support this work, so there was no industry funding. This is something that we worked from the side of our desks, and were supported by the salaries from our respective universities. Okay, is that closed? It's off the screen?
Brilliant.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
that's shut down. Thank you, Justine. That was fabulous. I was really struck by what you said, that we'd maybe only one sector of common mycorrhizal networks mapped, and from that we're extrapolating so much about what's going on in forests. That was really striking.
It was for us too, I should say. I mean, we can talk about it more in the Q&A.
Sure.
But probably as much as maybe people in the audience are feeling surprised, we were also very surprised. So the review ended up in a very different spot than what we expected. But we can talk about that more later.
Sure.
So yes.
I think some of what you said might be quite hard to hear for our listeners and watchers, but so I'm going to let you have a look at some of the questions in the Q&A that have come through so far, and I'm going to let you choose some of the ones that you feel that you can sensibly answer at the end.
Okay,
please
great.
do keep your questions coming for Justine while the next speaker is up. But I really think it's so important that as people who are in the tree care industry have a link to the current science, so that we're not projecting our ideas about society onto tree management or woodland management. So thank you ever so much for speaking to us. Right, Nadina. Nadina is going to be speaking to us about the interplay between nature, technology, and cities, I believe. Over to you.
Thank you, Emma. And I have to say thank you to Justine, because that was fascinating. And I saw a comment from an Ian Lorman, I think it was, in the chat that said, but I want it to be true. And I can completely relate to that as someone who's used the concept of Wood Wide Web in both my PhD research and now as just such a powerful storytelling tool. And I think that's what we, if I include myself as more of the practitioner, almost journalism role that I'm taking now, away from academia and speaking to a lot of you here in this audience today that are, of course, practitioners. I completely relate to you, Ian, when you said we want this to be true, because it is so incredible to see, facets and concepts from ecology and from forestry hit the mainstream, because they can be such helpful storytelling tactics that we need to convince people about the importance of our work. So it is a fascinating presentation, and so important to stay close to the scientific rigor that is science, and incredible to hear some of the research that you guys have been doing. So thank you, Justine. Fascinating. Switching gears, and I hope we can come back to kind of the parallels that I see also between my presentation and yours, Justine, in the Q&A. So switching gears a little bit to meeting the urban forestry innovators from my new book, The Nature of Our Cities. I'm really excited to share some of these takeaways and these characters with you, as I hope they'll really be able to also inspire what you guys do in practice as well. But just to quickly introduce myself, I started in ecology, and ultimately I did my PhD in ecological engineering. I was born in the Netherlands, but I grew up in Canada. I've been more or less back in the Netherlands for about 10 years now, but still spending a lot of time in Canada as well. And I do my work all over the world. My work, that being said, is less in academia these days, and more in what I said. I think I'm still kind of struggling with what exactly a title is, but I'm going to call it a little bit of a journalism role. So I'm a speaker, I'm a podcaster, I'm an author and a columnist, and recently also being involved in producing documentaries. For me, as an ecological engineer, parks, forests, urban forests, the urban, nature-based solutions, natural assets that we have, the natural resources, I always saw them not purely, but mostly through an ecological lens, right? As these really important facets that we have in our urban centers, and not only our dense urban cores, but also our suburban areas, as these really important ecological assets for intercepting our stormwater, combating flooding, combating extreme heat, creating more livable, climate resilient places to be. But it wasn't until I became a mom for the first time a year and a half ago that I started to see these urban forests and these urban parks as something that has such a critical social function, yes, but also a longevity function, right? There's nothing like becoming a parent that makes you want to live forever. And there's one study that completely changed a lot of my thinking about this, and that was by David Rojas-Rueda and his colleagues at the Colorado State University. What they essentially did is they did a huge systematic review and meta-analysis of all the studies that were looking between the link between greenness and mortality, specifically all-cause mortality. This is a bit complex, so I've helped break it down for us here. Essentially, what this study did is they reviewed over 9,000 studies. They chose 9 of them. So it was about 8 million people involved in these studies from 7 different countries. And they used something called NDVI. So for those of you that have worked on a canopy assessment, this is something that might be familiar to you. NDVI, or the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, is basically the simplest way we have to measure greenery using satellite imagery. So essentially what it does is it measures greenness, right? It gives this on a score. And they measured the study. What they did is they measured greenness, and they measured that within a 500-meter buffer of people's homes. And what they found, well, at least 78% of the studies agreed that more greenery equals living longer, meaning that even in a small increase, a 0.1 increase in NDVI actually resulted in a 4% lower chance of dying. So what does that all mean? Well, even as this study did, when you account for all of these different factors, right? We're looking at things like socioeconomic status, education levels, different makeups of our neighborhoods from a demographic perspective. Even when you count for all of that, urban forests and trees seem to be the intervention for shaping public health and longevity. And that completely revolutionized what I was doing, right? Because it took me from being in academia, understanding, I came from a soil science background, and being very much ingrained into, okay, what is the best kind of soil that our urban trees need to be focused in? And that's also what led me to the Wood Wide Web concept, because of course you can't even do that kind of research without running into mycorrhizae. And it took me from one that I would say was very ecologically focused into more of a calling, I would say, to try and understand why it is that we are still lacking greenery in so many neighborhoods around the world, right? This constant dichotomy that seems to exist between urban and economic and people development on the one side and nature on the other, and this frustration why we couldn't have both. And I think it's interesting as we address that to look at some of the reasons that the very first urban parks were created. This is a photo from 1934 when they were establishing Amsterdamse Bos, or the Amsterdam Forest. This is still today one of the world's largest urban forests. And the main reason why it was established at the time, other than the fact that there was a huge economic recession, huge unemployment rates, and this was a way to basically use cheap labor to create this massive urban forest. But all those socioeconomic factors aside, one of the main reasons they decided to create the Amsterdam Forest was to provide light, air, and space. And you could argue that that trilogy, light, air, and space, is the predominant reason why we still require urban nature to this day. But I would argue that in addition to light, air, and space, our urban parks and our urban forests now have to fulfill a whole laundry list of different duties. Everything from a place for movement and fitness, room for unsafe play, exposure to the sun, vitamin D, recreation, fresh air, happiness, stress reduction, air quality, stormwater management, filtration, shade, cooling, habitat, biodiversity, event venues, inspiration, creativity, and I would argue, most importantly, a place for spirituality. In an increasingly secular society that has lost touch with faith-based organizations, right? I think it's now the stats are like less than a fifth of people still attend, weekly religious ceremonies of any kind. We are drastically losing touch with our spirituality, and also thereby the lack of touch with the natural world. And the fact of the matter is, the majority of us live in cities, live in urban developments. So if we're not having that connection close to us, we're not having that connection at all. I for my both my podcast and for my book research, I was able to speak to Richard Louv, the author of The Last Child in the Woods, which also happens to be my favorite book, which I think is the question for the end. So spoiler alert, but we'll get to that later. He famously says, it's not time to go back to nature, but to go forwards to nature. And I love what he says there, but I made a slight amendment in my book. I say it's not time to go back to nature, but to go forwards with nature, right? And that goes at addressing this dichotomy between develop and nature, trying to figure out a way to go forwards with nature. But, we live in a modern world in modern cities, and the only way that we can truly do that is to have a modern approach. And for me, that modern approach has a role for technology to fulfill. I believe that in order to give nature its rightful place in cities and to reestablish, I would argue, that connection between people and nature, technology can play an important role in that. And so came the concept of Internet of Nature. The Internet of Nature is essentially an umbrella term, a classification of emerging technologies specifically designed to map, monitor, and manage nature, and most importantly, actually reconnect people to that nature around them. It came about in 2019 as I was preparing for a TEDx talk. When I was asked to do this, I got 3 weeks to prepare it. And there's nothing like having to prepare a 16.5-minute talk that really makes you distill, at the time, my academic research to one cohesive story, right? Stories are the best way to communicate big ideas to large audiences. And I figured that story needed a name. And the important that name ended up being Internet of Nature. And out of that came an academic paper. And then as COVID hit and I lost the opportunity to speak to a lot of people in person and visit conferences and festivals and things of that nature, the Internet of Nature podcast was born. And as I was, I defended my PhD in September of 2020, right in the heart of COVID. So right after that, I started this podcast, and it was such a wonderful medium to finally be able to have the platform to really get to the heart of the people behind this movement, because that's ultimately what this is. Yes, it's about the interesting technologies, but it's ultimately about the interesting people that are using them and in what ways. And that is exactly what I think we can learn from. So I was able to interview dozens of different different innovators in this space. And we're now going into our 6th season of the podcast in 2025, each one with a different sponsor, which has been a really fun project to work on. But ultimately, right, thinking that this would be a place for me to organize all of these stories and all of these people working in this space, it led to even more stories, because the one question that I would ask at the end of each podcast recording is, who are 3 more people working in this space that I should be talking to? So this led to this massive Excel sheet of all of these people that I'm still in the process of talking to, but it also led to me feeling like I finally had enough content for a book. This book that I'd always wanted to write ever since I was a kid. I love writing. In fact, as a point to Justine's, comment about scientific rigor, the one comment that I often got when I was in academia was that I wrote too creatively. So you can take that one of 2 ways. You can say get out of academia, or you can say write a book for the general public. So I guess I did both in a sense. And that is essentially what this book is. It was published by HarperCollins, which I'm massively proud of, because what it tells me is that it's giving a certain legitimacy and authority to stories about urban nature and about urban forestry and arboriculture, and helping to bring those into the mainstream, which, to Justine's point, is so incredibly important to get, more respect and funding and understanding of the work that we do behind the scenes. And it was published into Dutch by Leno this past September, which, as a Dutch Canadian, was a very, very special milestone. Now, the book is the chapters, each delving into a different urban issue, are sandwiched between a prologue and an epilogue, describing a city completely desolate of nature and a city completely engulfed, completely nature rich, and the difference between the two. But within that, there are 9 different chapters. It is a science-driven book. So it's filled with stats and figures and research about why this is so important, but it is also a book with a lot of dialogue. It's written for the general public. It's meant to draw the reader in. It's basically like you as the reader are standing beside me as I'm meeting all of these interesting people traveling around the world and looking at their work, speaking to them about their work and learning from them and how we can apply that to on a broader scale. And each chapter delves into these different urban issues, whether it's resource mismanagement, tree management, extreme heat, wildfires, flooding, biodiversity, mental health, longevity, and one close to my heart, children's connection to nature. Now, what I want to do in the rest of the time that we have today, I mean, the book has, it's chock full of all these different examples from AI firefighting robots and tree establishing sensors and AI insect monitoring, a lot of different interesting ideas there. But because, of course, we're here today for the Arboricultural Association, I wanted to dig into the book and really take away the key lessons for arboriculturalists and for urban foresters that I believe you can really take away from this book. I got the opportunity to present some of these ideas specifically for urban and community foresters at the Partners in Community Forestry conference in Chicago, which is put on by the Arbor Day Foundation and the ISA. 2 weeks ago, and got a lot of positive feedback there. So I'm curious to hear what you guys think and if you feel like these are relevant new ideas that most importantly you can actually use in your day-to-day work. Number one being, we have to move from planting to growing. I think this is absolutely critical as we move the discipline of urban forestry forward, right? We are gone are the days where it's just, the right tree at the right time in the right place. Of course, that's important, but we need to be putting just as much thought into the aftercare, into the monitoring of the trees that we're putting there to make sure that they're not just there for seasons, but that they're there for generations. Because otherwise, really, what is the point? It's disastrous from a public relations standpoint, and it's also such a waste of funding. And of course, of the tree itself, which many, I don't have to tell you guys, but many people in the public don't even realize that trees that are planted in cities have been growing in nurseries for 10 to 15 years. The fact, if we're not moving towards, planting, from planting to growing, it's really such a waste on a massive scale. Now, most of you here, if not all of you in this audience, I'm sure are aware of iTree. For those of you that aren't, iTree is a software suite developed by the USDA Forest Service to give us a monetary value of the ecosystem services that urban trees, all trees, I should say, are providing, right? So things like the air quality, the carbon sequestration, the avoided runoff, the energy impacts, and that of the impact on human health, giving us an actual dollar value of what those things are worth. What some of you might not know is that, of course, iTree is only a model, meaning that it's a black box and its output is only as good as its input. And that input, which is heavily reliant on field data, right? The measurements about the tree height, crown base height, diameter at breast height, crown volume, that in a lot of cities is not there. And this is something that absolutely shocked me, especially when you're looking at a lot of Canadian and American cities. Most cities do not have an operational tree inventory for the trees on public land, let alone what's happening on private land. Luckily in Europe, things are a little bit better due to our regulation, our legislation. I know especially in the Netherlands, this is absolutely mandated to have this on public land, that is. But that field data needs a lot of work. And a tree inventory is, of course, the way to go about that. Before I continue, I should mention here, you'll see in the top left corner of most of the slides, you'll see a little QR code and a little face. What that means is there is actually a corresponding podcast episode to some of these things that I'm talking about. So if that's of interest to you, you can scan that QR code. To be able to move the tree inventory, which is necessary to get this field data, which is so critical to understanding the monetary value of our ecosystem services, which in turn are so important for that storytelling component and convincing these stakeholders, we need to improve that field data. How do we do that? Sending out massive armies of tree inventory technicians is not possible. I don't need to tell you guys that we are strapped for resources. It's very difficult to do so. And it is often a massive capital investment. What we need to move towards is more of a subscription model where we can spread out those costs over the series of 10 years and not have these massive capital investments, right, that come every 10 to 20 years to be doing these inventories. The way to be doing that is through smart tree inventories. There's a couple of companies leading the way. I got the opportunity to speak to Josh Bohanik of Davy, who is Davy Tree Experts and Davy Resource Group, who has been collaborating with a company called Greehill. And essentially what they do is they create ground LiDAR-based tree inventories, meaning that they have a car like the one you see behind this woman here that has a LiDAR scanner on top of it. Essentially what it's doing is it's creating something that looks like this, which kind of looks like a beautiful abstract painting that you might want to hang up in your living room, but it is in fact a 3D point cloud, a digital twin of the surroundings. And there are companies like Davy and Greehill, but also Tree Tracker in the Netherlands that will actually build algorithms that will mask out everything that the LiDAR scanner picks up on, except for the trees. And what you're left with is a 3D digital twin of these trees. Okay, well, so what? What can that offer you? Well, it can offer you that field data. And that field data so you can have better iTree metrics. So that's great. So we've got that figured. But the number one reason why I'm so excited about this technology is, remember all the way in the beginning, this takeaway was from planting to growing. The only way that we can move from planting to growing is if we have a radically different way to actually measure that growth over time so that we can incentivize for it. When we're using things like a smart tree inventory, we can actually move for the first time to not incentivizing the amount of stems that we are planting every year, right? If you imagine traditional tree accounting, if we can call it that, very much looks at the amount of stems that are planted every single year and the amount of stems that are removed. So on paper, you might have a mayor that says, let's plant 20,000 trees. So you've planted 20,000 trees. One, we don't know how many of those trees are actually surviving year over year. And two, you may have actually removed less trees that year, but they might have been a lot bigger and older in stature, meaning that the net gain, if you're considering the biomass, you've actually had a loss, even though on paper it looks like a net positive because you planted more stems, right? So being able to use this LiDAR technology and having our trees mapped in this way, we're actually able to incentivize crown volume growth. There is a city that I interviewed for the book called Woerden. It's a small city south of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And they actually changed the definition of their urban forest, the definition of success of their urban forest to move away from stems planted to actually crown volume growth, meaning that every year they look at their crown volume growth and how it's increased, and they actually dictate funding and care based on that. It's a much more transparent, much more honest, and it's an approach that's built with a lot more integrity. It's also more cost effective, and it's a way to actually, the arborists and the urban foresters that a city either has in-house or that contracts out, it's a way to use their time much more effectively, being able to send them to areas that need to be ground truth, that need to be checked for condition, that need species identification, and focus their time in that way. I spoke to many arborists, including the head chief warden of the city of Boston, that was using Post-it notes and scribbles on his hands to keep count and keep tally of all the different trees he was managing for. We need to move from planting to growing and to a modern day tree inventory method. Number 2 is dare to protect private trees. Now, I know this is scary, not politically sexy, and there's nothing more concerning than trying to use taxpayer dollars on private land. But this is in fact something that I believe as urban foresters and arboriculturalists, we need to start understanding better. For the book, I got the opportunity to interview Matthew Wells. Some of you might know him because he's a Brit, and before he moved first to New York and then to Santa Monica, where I met him, he worked for the City of London and for Tandem as well. And he worked in the private sector before that. As you can see on his car, he is the head public landscape manager for the city of Santa Monica. And when I was visiting Santa Monica and interviewing him, I got the opportunity for him to tell me about all of the fantastic heritage, history, and really cultural significance that Santa Monica puts on those trees and the amazing initiatives that they've been able to do on public land. But what he also shared with me is that things were not actually that rosy in Santa Monica. In fact, they had a massive blind spot. You see, it wasn't until Matthew Wells started working with Planet Geo and Earth Define, which is an urban forestry technology company out of Colorado. They're, of course, famous for their tree plotter software. They also have this partnership with Earth Define, which created the US Tree Map, which is a 60-centimeter resolution map of the entire US that shows you all the different locations of these trees, that does these individual tree crown delineation, as you can see. The thing is, trees and their benefits don't care where they stand, right? Whether it's here, 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 doesn't matter, right? All of these trees, whether on public or private land, are providing benefits to the community. They're also providing risks, right? If you have a tree that is infected with name whatever pest or disease, just because it's on private land doesn't mean it's no longer part of your purview, right? We as arboriculturists and urban foresters should be responsible for the urban forest in its totality. That is the private and the public lands together. Now, after working with Earth Define and Planet Geo and taking that bird's eye view of what was going on in Santa Monica, Matt discovered something pretty shocking. He discovered that from 2014 to 2020, tree canopy on private land actually decreased by 33 acres. He estimated that to be about 2,800 mature trees. The problem is that Matt only has room for about 2,000 trees, mature trees, on public lands, meaning that he simply can't outplant private destruction. This, unfortunately, is not just an issue in Santa Monica. I think it's showcased there well. You can see it clear, but this is something that we're seeing all around the world, right? Whether it's Amsterdam, Toronto, New York City, Sydney, the majority of the urban forest is, in fact, on private land, which is something that a lot of the general public doesn't know. The best research we have is it says the estimate is somewhere between 50 to 70% of the urban forests around the world are on private land. The majority of the general public does not know this. The general public sees a tree anywhere in a city, they automatically assume that it is within the domain of the public municipality. Unfortunately, that is not the case. So yes, this is a massive challenge, but I also believe it is a massive opportunity because it means that a lot of landowners can benefit they can augment a lot more to the urban forest. But it also means that as urban foresters and arboriculturists, we need to dare to take a look at what's going on private lands. Lastly, the takeaway I want to share with you is that we need to become better storytellers. We just need to do it in a scientifically robust way, as to Justine's point. I think one of the best storytellers that we have out there in the urban forester sphere is Dr. Cecil Konijnendijk, a name I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Dr. Cecil Konijnendijk took urban forestry to the mainstream a number of years ago when he came up with the 3-30-300 rule. For those of you that haven't come across it, essentially what it stipulates is that every person living in an urban environment should be able to see 3 trees from their window, 3 decent trees. Their neighborhood should have 30% canopy cover, and they should be within a 300-meter walk from a park, or a 300-meter distance from a park. What I think is so powerful about the 3-30-300 rule is that it is, one, simplistic, right? It's simple, it's easy to communicate to a general audience, but it is also scientifically robust. One of the reasons why I think it's scientifically robust is that it inherently has this system of checks and balances in place. One of the main issues, right, if you look at the middle, the 30% canopy cover, so I'm sure many of you urban foresters in the audience will know this has gotten a lot of critique in the past, right? Because your city can have, even 40% canopy cover. But if that is, unequally accessible, if that is unequally distributed across your city, if you happen to have something like, the Amsterdam forest included in your municipality boundaries, yeah, you're going to have a massive canopy cover. But does that mean that people in the inner city neighborhoods or that people in the outside neighborhoods or less socioeconomically advantaged neighborhoods are going to have the same access to trees? No. And that is why I think it has this great system of checks and balances where you have also every person should be able to see 3 decent trees, and should be able to be within a 300-meter distance from a park, which I think is so great, because I think often in the urban forestry world, we lose also the social importance of parks as a whole. It's not only about trees, it's also about that park access as well. Now, as you can see here by some of these, it's gotten all these different media coverage, by the World Economic Forum was a big one. And he did TEDx talk as this as well, it was in the Atlantic, which I believe was a really powerful way to get broader audiences, the general public, but also politicians, economic developers, property developers, which I think is really interesting, talking about this. Another way to become better storytellers is to actually allow the trees to speak for themselves. This is the thinking behind Puk van Dijk's initiative, Reuzen van Noord. Puk van Dijk is a theater director. She's based in Amsterdam North, and she had a very nomadic childhood. She moved from place to place, and when it came time for her to settle down and have her family of her own, she decided to settle down into Amsterdam North, which is a post-industrial neighborhood, and like many post-industrial neighborhoods, dealing with a lot of issues like gentrification, deforestation, rapid development, pollution. And as she was interviewing her new neighbors, because she is a theater director and she sees the world through stories, as she was interviewing her new neighbors about this, she realized that a lot of these issues that they mentioned were actually similar issues that the original inhabitants of this neighborhood were dealing with. The elms, the ginkgos, the oaks, the maples, the ashes. So what she decided to do is create this immersive audio experience called Reuzen van Noord, or Giants of North. And essentially is this walking tour of 6 talking trees. It uses software called Echoes, which basically means that it works with geolocated sound. So instead of this traditional audio tour where you're having to scan every QR code for the next audio segment to start, it actually works based on your GPS location. So you move around this area, and as soon as you walk into this geofence, the next audio segment is triggered, which creates this really interesting immersive listening experience, because often you hear the trees before you see them. Now, one story that I want to share with you that I think is especially relevant considering the topic of today's webinar is Maraya, the lonely oak. And the monologue that Maraya shares, she actually refers to the wood wide web, and she uses it in this context of feeling lonely, because ever since she expanded the road, she was no longer able to talk to her friends on the other side of the road. Again, just relating back to the importance of having these concepts from ecology being used for storytelling tactics, just make sure maybe it's being used in the right way. But the powerful, I'm thinking back to Ian's quote, but I want it to be true. Mariah definitely wants it to be true. I also meet Dea and I meet Harry. Dea is dealing is confronting the fact that 2 of her friends were actually cut down, and what deforestation meant on a broader scale to that neighborhood. And Harry, you actually heard him coughing before you heard him speaking, because he's planted right beside a busy highway, dealing with a lot of the pollution that's coming from that. So, this is my work. I work with trees and with nature and with urban ecology on a daily basis. I got the opportunity to visit the premiere, listen to the premiere of this initiative. This is me with my family enjoying the tour here. And what I love so much about it is, even me working in this space, I cannot walk by or bike past these trees without thinking about these stories. And if that's what it did for me, I can't imagine what that does for the general public. And speaking of the general public, why not let them speak for the trees and tell the rest of the public what they think about the trees? This is what ended up happening in the city of Melbourne. And this was run by Yvonne Lynch. Yvonne Lynch was the former head of urban forestry and urban ecology for the city of Melbourne. And in 2012, she had a major problem. Her trees were dying by the dozens, dealing with drought and extreme heat. And understandably so, the urban residents had a lot of questions. So she decided to couple each tree's ID number to an email address, so that each, if you had a question about a specific tree, you could email that specific tree. A nice streamlined management approach, right? Well, what ended up happening next completely took Yvonne and her team by surprise. Instead of writing in questions and concerns about the trees, people in fact started writing love letters to the trees. Love letters like, "Hello, weeping myrtle. I'm sitting inside near you, and I notice on the urban tree map you don't have many friends nearby. I think that's sad. So I want you to know I'm thinking of you. I also want to thank you for providing oxygen for us to breathe in the hustle and bustle of the city. Best regards, Neil Roberts. Little did Yvonne know that on the other side of the world in Halifax, Canada, there sat a master's student named Julietta Sorensen Kuss, and she was at a urban forestry conference in Canada listening to the story of Yvonne Lynch, and she immediately became wildly inspired to make this even more accessible to people. So instead of emailing a tree campaign, she set up a text a tree campaign. She decided to give 15 trees in the Halifax Public Gardens a phone number that could actually be texted. And what was part academic study, there was a research paper published about it, part citizen engagement, turned out to be a wild success. It only lasted 2 months, but engaged nearly 3,000 people, and there was over 10,000 text messages received. I'll give you an example of some of these. Some of these were grateful. Things like, "You have been here since I was little and used to come with my grandparents. We always got ice cream after enjoying the gardens. Thank you for your shade and beauty." Some of them were more apologetic, like, "Thank you for your service, dear tree. Do you feel humans are grateful toward you? We hit you with a frisbee today. Sorry about that." And some of them were just kind of cute, like, "My daughter wants to know, do you have a baby tree?" Others were a lot more somber. In fact, people felt comfortable to share some of their deepest, darkest internal things that they were struggling with. Things like, "Hello, Miss Luna Ruby," and this is Miss Luna Ruby here behind you in the text message on the screen. It says, "I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to tell you the comfort you have provided. You may not even know that I have sat under your leafy canopy, but your heavy, gnarled branches that exude wisdom were there during my most difficult times, the death of my mom, my dad, and even during a frightening diagnosis. You may not have been able to reach out with your branches, but you provided comfort when I needed it most." So what does this tell us, right? Well, I think one of the participants of the Text a Tree project can tell us best. And that was,
"I feel more connected to the trees in the public gardens, and oddly enough, to all trees. Seriously, I'm not entirely sure how. I think what happened is that I began to see each tree as an individual living creature, and that made me care about the survival of other trees and by extension, all beings. It made me realize I'm not alone in this world." I think what is so impactful about these stories is that it shows that technology is simply the facilitator to these interactions, right? It is not a distraction. It is not a replacement. It is simply an augmentation. And that is, I think, true throughout all of these take-home messages that I hope you've taken, that I hope you'll take with you into your day-to-day practice. And those were moving from planting to growing, daring to explore private trees, and becoming better storytellers. In all of these ways, technology is the tool, nature is the goal. And I hope that that is critical and I think that is a critical, important message to take forward in your day-to-day work, is that technology can help us meet a lot of our goals, and to just leave it behind by the sidelines simply because we think we're too old-fashioned or we don't need it, or it's not a useful tool that we could be using, I think is quite foolish in 2024, moving into 2025, where we're moving into a world that desperately needs more trees and desperately needs more greenery in its cities. If anything that I said inspires you or you're interested in learning more, of course, I encourage you to check out the podcast and, of course, the book. If you do already have the book, or if you're going to pick up a copy, please let me know, and I would be more than happy to send you the free official reading guide that goes along with it. So I appreciate you very much for your attention, and I hope we get into some interesting, perhaps controversial discussion in the Q&A. Thank you.
Wow, Nadina, thank you. You had an awful lot of positive responses throughout your talk, but especially when you proposed that we should be going forwards with nature. That was a very popular statement. So yeah, thank you again for such a great talk. We've got a ton of questions as usual, and I'm going to let you have a look through them yourselves, and you can help me pick out the ones that you fancy. But perhaps I can kick us off with a few. As always, we'll send you all of the questions after the webinar, so that if you feel like you really want to get back to someone on their particular question that we haven't got to, you're very welcome to do so, but no pressure. Where should I start? Okay, I'm going to start with Justine because she's been resting, giving Nadina a little break. But then Justine, you can pick one as well. So I'm going to kick off with one from Anthony, and he asks sort of at what level do we think fungi are supposed to be connecting other trees? Are we thinking that they are primarily sort of single species networks? Are there many individuals of the same species, or indeed multi-species networks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, first of all, so with the genotype mapping, the reason we do it at a genotype level, so this is like an individual. I'm a genotype, Nadina's a genotype, Emma's a different genotype. And researchers have to do it at that level because different genotypes don't fuse. So we have to know which genotype it is. We could examine roots to see if they have the same species of fungi colonizing them, but that doesn't mean, even if it's the same species, that it's going to form a common mycorrhizal network. It has to be at the genotype level. So that's sort of a technical explanation for that. But I have a colleague, Anders Dahlberg, and I kind of like the way that you're nodding, Emma. Do you know him?
I'm an ecologist, but we'll talk later.
Oh, okay. So Anders, the way that he explains it, and again, this is another idea that needs testing, but to me, it kind of holds up. But the way that he explains common mycorrhizal networks in a forest is more thinking about it as a mosaic. So you have fungal species that form very small genets. Maybe they connect 2 or 3 trees. You have other fungal species that form, large genets. Maybe they connect 10 or 20 trees or something in the forest. But then you can think about it as, these different fungal species, different patches, and forming a mosaic. So it's moving away from this idea of an internet, because that sort of assumes there's one fungal species or genotype that's connecting all trees in a forest, and it functions as an internet. And I, say internet loosely. But I think Anders and what we know of sort of fungal biology in different species, I think he's kind of onto something with this mosaic idea. And so there's many different fungal species in the forest. The genets they produce are of different sizes. They're, out there all together in the forest. And yeah, it forms a mosaic, not maybe an internet. But again, we need more of these maps to know, is that the case? Yeah. I also want to point out the common mycorrhizal genotype maps we have. So 4 of them are from an interior Douglas fir forest in British Columbia. So it's a province next to me. And so that is from Suzanne Simard's work. And then 1 has been done in a pine forest in Japan. So just so that's clear. And so these are done in mature forests, but most of the work, all of the work on resource transfer, this has not been done in old growth forests. So the ideas come from old growth forests. They're inspired by old growth forest. The research does not occur in these old growth forests aside from these maps. So I just want to be clear on that.
Great, thank you. And a quick follow-up then. Edgar asked, are there any studies on tropical tree species?
There are some, yeah. So as part of my presentation, I do have a slide that shows the locations of where all these studies have been done. For time, I didn't put it in. But yes, so there are a few. So most of the studies, I would say Western North America, but there are a few that have been done in the tropics. And I think when we counted up overall, there was about 26 studies that have been done on this topic. And there are a few in the tropics, yes. Not very many, though.
Okay, brilliant. So I'm going to come back to you with a question that you've chosen in a second, but I'm going to go over to Nadina now. Nadina, if I may, I've got a question from Tom McBain, and he asks about changing perceptions and behaviours. So in communities or deprived areas that maybe don't appreciate the benefits of trees in their neighbourhood, given your experience as a communicator, how do we tackle that? What do we do about that?
Yeah, that immediately makes me think of the work of Christine Carmichael, Dr. Christine Carmichael, that I cover in my book as well. She did really fascinating research in Detroit, Michigan, where essentially a nonprofit went in, wanted to plant a bunch of trees, as nonprofits like to do, and they got a bunch of what's called no tree requests. Actually, about 25% of the trees were actually turned down because the people in the neighborhood didn't want them. And she was, well, one, the nonprofit was totally stooped, right? Like, how could you not want trees? Everybody loves trees, right? And I think that's something that in our industry we run up a lot. Like, how could you not love trees? We're all tree lovers and tree huggers and blah, blah, blah. And I think, well, there's a lot of arboriculturists that would be like, maybe not. But that to the side. She dove into this and saying, okay, what's the reason behind that? When she discovered that they were in fact not no tree requests, they were in fact requests for more information. So what they ran into was nonprofits that would come in, plant the trees, and all of a sudden it would be their responsibility to maintain them. They didn't have the time or the resources or the money to do that. Some had actually really traumatic stories where the roots of trees actually got into their drainage pipes and they had to move and they didn't have the economic resources to do those, and it caused a huge mess. So there's a lot of kind of trees are the enemy almost mindset. And it was also an issue of like, well, we actually do want a tree. We just don't want that tree, because of course nonprofits are interested in creating, this nonprofit anyways, in creating something called heat equity, right? So they want to create big, huge crown volume shady trees. The people in this neighborhood, they were open to a tree, but they wanted smaller ornamental trees or perhaps fruit-bearing trees. So there was, and I think that just goes to show is that it's not so much pro-tree, anti-tree, as I think a lot of this likes to, people love to be black and white and put it in two different categories. I think there is a ton of nuance there, and it ultimately comes down to having conversations with neighborhoods on the ground, and ideally working with, having these tree planting campaigns, having them really be run by a resident of that street, having them be the cheerleaders for it, making sure it comes from them, and having them really understand what are the specific issues that they're dealing with on the ground. So that's one, right? Making sure you have the community buy-in. One more quick thing I'll mention that I think is kind of a positive, fun story, because Tom mentioned the vandalism. There's a story that I've talked about in the podcast before, from a company called Soil Mania. And they did a project in a very small village in Gijsteren in the south of the Netherlands. And what they had there is they had a number of trees planted, all vandalized. So it was a big issue that they were running into. And they were all vandalized by a certain group of youth, let's call them, that were hanging around in the square. And they, the trees were there. They didn't have, again, it's this community buy-in. They felt like it was their square, that they hung out there. It was their square, and they weren't involved in this procedure. So they tried again, but this time they worked with sensors. So every tree that was installed, they actually installed a moisture sensor as well, and they showed the kids how to see it on their phone on a mobile application, and said, "Look, these are your trees. This is your job to take care of them. We're trusting you. We're relying on you. Trees, it's important because of this, this, and this." Tried to relate it back to their family and, specific reason why it's important for them. Showed them on the app. And every time that the soil was too dry, they were actually invited to water these trees. And it worked actually quite well. It worked so well that an arborist that they didn't know from the municipality went by the project one time. A story he told me, went by the project one time to go check on the trees, and immediately this group came to him and said, "What are you doing with our trees? Did you ask us?" So, it's a hopeful, optimistic story. There's these big, beautifully, growing into maturity trees now in this public square in an area where they were once vandalized, and something as cheap as a soil sensor and a mobile app helped make it happen. So I think there's, hopeful, optimistic stories here, but it's that community buy-in. You can't, and I talk about this in the book, we have these wonderful GIS mapping technologies that tells us exactly the places where we need to be planting trees for the best climate, heat, flooding, health impacts. That's great data. That's a great place to know how to start. That doesn't then mean dropping trees from the sky and making it happen. It's a ground up approach.
Brilliant. That's a good story with the youths and the sensors. Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's so important in our sort of well-meaning attempt to achieve tree or green equity that it's through communities rather than to them. But in practice, it's just getting it right. And we've got a follow-up for you, if you don't mind, from Matt Disney. And he links your talk back to the Wood Wide Web. So he says, does the 330-300 rule have similar problems to the Wood Wide Web in that it's a great hook, the comms is awesome, but are there sort of gaps in the evidence, particularly around how much canopy cover we need?
Yeah, it's because the issues with canopy cover have been around for a long time, right? And there's a lot of cities and more desert ecosystems that, do not feel the same way. And it's the benefits of nature are very much focused around trees and around forests. But we also know that lakes, bodies of water, desert ecosystems can also have wonderful impacts for our physical and mental health as well. So I want to make sure that we're not losing how important those kinds of natural ecosystems can be in this world that is obsessed with trees and all the benefits that trees can have, right? But I think in a lot of places, trees do make a lot of sense. And and maybe you missed that, Matthias, but I did talk about that. I do like the fact that the 330-300 rule has kind of this checks and balances built in, right? So it's not just about the 30% canopy cover. It's also about meeting that goal of being able to see 3 decent trees from their window. Decent meaning big, old, mature trees. So if you're able to do that, then you're automatically course correcting for any kind of equity issues that you might run into. And the same thing with that 300 meter guideline as well. What was I going to say? It's going to come to me in a second. I had something. Continue and it'll come back to me.
That was a great answer. Thank you. Okay, Justine, is there a question that you like? And if not, I'll throw one at you. You're on mute though.
I remember what I was going to say. Sorry, can I add it?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, then give Justine time to look at the questions. What I will say is that the best research that we have out there so far of the 330-300 rule and how cities are actually hitting it, there was an analysis done by Cobra Groen Inzicht, Cobra Green Insights, which is an urban forest technology company in the Netherlands. And they actually quantified the 330-300 rule for all of the Netherlands. I'm super curious, just in the chat quickly, how many of the homes in the Netherlands do you think met the 330-300 rule, percentage-wise? 0 to 100 to 100% of the homes. How many? 0, 20%, 30%. Any more guesses? 80%, 75%. Okay.
Covering all bases.
Matthias was closest. He said 5%. It was actually 7%. And that's in the Netherlands, right? Which many people would consider there are many people that would consider the Netherlands as a very progressive, very green, good urban design centered country. And even in the Netherlands, we are struggling. It is indeed sad, Paul, 7% sad times. Yeah. 7%. So I think that just shows that we do have a long ways to go. And I think to circle back to Matthias' original point, is the 330-300 rule, a 330-300 rule, is it too strict? Is it even possible? And I think that's something that we don't know yet. And I think that's something that we're going to, as we understand more about how this rule can be applied, it's something that I think we're going to find out more about and see, maybe it is too strict.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, Justine.
Yeah.
Which one are you going for?
I don't know. It's hard to scroll through. Do you have a question up? Because I actually can't find any.
I'd like to know the answer to. So
okay, please.
I've got one from Alexandra. Hi, Alexandra. She said, do you think that decisions we may be making forestry, and I'm going to add arboriculture, based on the idea of the Wood Wide Web, might be bad for forests or trees?
This is a good question. So recently, I was on a podcast that was from like an extension office from a university in the Pacific Northwest. And this was interesting to me in that, so I'm an academic. I obviously have less experience in forestry, like I'm not on the ground in that way. I'm more in a research space. But these people that we were talking to, so they deal with private landowners and dealing with their forest lots. And what they were saying is that more and more people were reluctant to cut down trees in their private lots because they were worried about losing tree families, about breaking up the wood wide web. And these were disease trees. And so they were sort of puzzled and confused by this backlash. And so they were asking me about it. So I think that might be one example of hanging on. And I should say, I mean, there's other reasons to hang on to a diseased tree in terms of like, we don't need to cut it and remove it from the forest. Those dead trees play all sorts of roles. So I don't want to diminish that. It just depends on what you have that forest there. But I mean, if you're growing it for timber, that would be one reason that maybe you do want to take that diseased tree out. But I thought that was really interesting, though, to hear how the Wood Wide Web was affecting people's management of forests. But I should say, though, that there is lots and lots of research to show the importance of big, old trees. We don't need this Wood Wide Web story to exist, to understand their importance, to value them. There was lots of research done before this to show their importance. So, and I would say at this point, like anybody relying on this Wood Wide Web story or this idea as trees talk below ground to support their cause in forest conservation and protection, it might be actually undermining them at this point because it is, like I said, it's a story that has very little scientific basis. And if they're looking to research and science to support their cause and they're drawing on this Wood Wide Web story, I think, yeah, there might be some problems with that. And like I said, there's lots of research out there that already shows why we should be thinking about these old trees, reconsidering forest management. I don't think we need this story to move ahead in how we think about forests.
Yeah, I think to add to Justine's point there about all the great research that already exists and not having to rely on this Wood Wide Web story per se. And I saw a couple of forget the comment, so remind me, but somebody said something along the lines of like, I didn't know this many people had so many nice things to say about trees, in both the text a tree and the email a tree example that I shared. And that's exactly it, we don't, I think, realize, especially as urban foresters, we're so in our own bubble that we forget that to the majority of urban residents really do value trees and the work that we're doing to protect them. It's easy to forget that, right? Because urban forestry is kind of like thankless work, right? You're doing stuff now that you're probably not going to see, the fruits of your labor for another 20, 40, 50, 60 years from now, and if not longer, because of course, planting to growing. So I think having the opportunities for residents to share stories about what specific trees mean to them is such a powerful way. And that can bring in parts of science if necessary, but it's also just getting at the heart of what these trees mean to people. And that's ultimately what urban forestry is, right? It's this intersection between people and trees, and having more stories to support your work that way, I think is a much more powerful storytelling tactic and communication tactic than, as Justine said, something like the Wood Wide Web, which is just, I think you rightfully said that, Justine, is undermining a lot of that, right? And I think ultimately people's stories is some of the most powerful communication tactics that we have.
Thank you both. To build on that, Nadina, one for you then. Ian, I'll paraphrase what he said, but we like to use iTree and sort of economic values of trees to justify their planting and their protection. But are we at risk of undervaluing trees then in terms of their spiritual, historical, or even ecological value by focusing on that?
Massively. I think you only have to go to the New York City tree map to see this. There are some old trees that you can click on, and then the it's like, oh, the benefit of this tree is like $76 this year. And you're like, huh? And I think that is the big danger to putting a monetary value in trees, is that we're undervalue them, right? I will look at it, it's very, very, very difficult to value, cultural heritage, historical significance, right? It's like trying to put a price on a Vincent van Gogh painting or like a Rembrandt painting. It's impossible to put a real price tag on that. It's the same thing with our old trees, especially in our, the witness trees, the things that they've seen, the things that they've gone through. It's impossible really to put a price tag on that. That being said, if we don't, I think that's more dangerous, because we are, we live in an economic system that values that. And I think it's not until we do that we can really start to see, that we can really start to get things like both municipalities but specifically property developers on board, see how important it is. And we put really, maybe we just need to tweak the price a little bit. When we put really high prices on them, it's going to become incentivized to actually build and design around those trees, which we can do. We've done it for centuries. We can do it again, instead of chopping them down and planting new ones, because, we're in this thing that a replanting obligation, that is the same thing. Trees are not interchangeable in that way. And I will say thank you to the research of Dr. Jeffrey Donovan from the U.S. Forest Service, which I highly recommend. He's based in the Pacific Northwest. He is doing incredible research to actually monetize, not necessarily in dollars, but in human lives. When you remove trees from an ecosystem, how many lives that actually costs. And I think that is such a powerful tool that goes beyond monetary value, that will become really, really important in communicating the value of trees in the future.
Nice. Okay, I'm going to come back to you for your last preferred question, but back over to Justine then. Nicola asks, what do you think about adding mycorrhizal powders? And I'll just go back to the previous question about how our thinking about mycorrhizas are good and essential, and trees are connected, leads many practitioners to want to add mycorrhiza to help trees and to help this wood wide web. So tell me what I should be telling practitioners about mycorrhizal powder.
Okay, so I am more of a proponent of managing forests so that there would be no need to ever have to add mycorrhizal fungi. Leaving trees behind, protecting your soil. These are all things that you can do to protect the mycorrhizal fungi in your forest. The trouble with these mycorrhizal powders is often what you buy in a store is not viable. So you could be adding dead spores, you could be adding fertilizer. It's it's an unregulated market. I speak from Canada and the US. I'm actually not 100% sure what it's like in Europe, but I know over here in North America, it's not regulated. And there was a recent study, this was on arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, not ectomycorrhizal fungi, but they are still important for many tree species. And then they surveyed they surveyed a range of products coming from different stores. And most often, these products either had fertilizer in it, and that was the effect that you were seeing. But in a lot of these products, there actually was fungal pathogens in them. And so they weren't mycorrhizal fungal inoculum. It was a fungal pathogen that was being spread around. So, and there are some concerns about taking these fungi from one place and then moving it to another place, especially when you think about invasive species. Like, we don't have a good handle yet on what we're moving around. And I think we probably want to be a little bit more precautionary. But I would say put that aside and just thinking about your dollars. I think in most cases, you don't need to add these mycorrhizal fungi. They are already in the soil. And it's only under really extreme circumstances that the mycorrhizal fungi that the trees need would be gone. So, for example, after mining and the ecosystem is destroyed, then, that might be a case, maybe we do want to add them in. But in most people's gardens or their backyards, they are there. And so I don't know. This is a funny story. I was in a store and I bought a shrub, and they would only warranty the shrub for me if I bought the store's mycorrhizal inoculum. And then I gave do you know who I am? But I explained to them, there is no good reason I need to buy this mycorrhizal inoculum. It probably doesn't work, and there is nothing wrong with the soil in my backyard. But they wouldn't warranty the plant. And that was really irritating to me. So obviously everyone gets the point. So I'm not a fan of these products.
It's always great to get to pull out the professor card, I'm sure.
It's so rare that I get to say that. So I was quite excited. Yeah.
I'm sure they were like, well, Justine, if your soil is so good, then you don't need a warranty.
Maybe. But actually they were like, we have no idea who you are, lady. Get out of the line. Yeah.
Brilliant. I think we've only got time for one last question before I move on to our final question about your favorite tree book. So, Nadina, do you have one that you'd like to answer?
I don't. I think I scrolled through. I think I got to all of them. Did I miss anything?
Oh, wow.
Well, Christine just recently asked, is I2 ever going to go into biodiversity services? I think that kind of links back to what we were saying before, that what I was saying about the New York City tree map. If you go there, I think it gives you rainwater, particulate matter, and carbon. And also, like, if we could just have a moment for carbon sequestration, like on the list of ecosystem services that urban trees do for us, carbon sequestration is maybe number 45. Like, I think that is like the most, like, if we could just move away from talks around, well, we're going to plant trees here in this urban park or on this urban corporate conference because it's going to sequester, offset some of the carbon that we've put out as a corporate, or some of the cars that drive around the city. Like, we need to really move away from that kind of, speaking of like incorrect storytelling, that's a great example of one. So I think that is a shame about, how the iTree method has been used so far, is that, to the earlier point, I think it is undervaluing individual urban trees. I do think a lot of that has to do with that as I said in the presentation, the field data is just not up to par. Your output is only going to be as good as your input. So I do think ground-based LiDAR inventories, smart tree inventories are going to offer us a way to improve that field data. But I think we got to improve the model as well. And I think one of the key ways to do that is including human health impacts. Jeffrey Donovan is leading the work on that. Biodiversity would be incredible to add to that as well, right? Because there's, certain trees, as we know, London plane, not doing very much for biodiversity versus an oak, all these different things that are currently not being taken into account as well. So I think we need to massively increase the ecosystem services that we are quantifying. But I think we need to also maintain our scientific rigor when we do that, and only add those when we feel like we really have the computations to back them up. And that is something Bill Anderson just said, carbon sequestration is routinely overestimated. We can easily do that with biodiversity as well. So we just need to be careful.
Fantastic. Thank you. Good. Well, I'm so sorry to everybody who hasn't had a question answered, but as I said earlier, rest assured that all of your questions will go to our excellent speakers. And if they have time in their very busy schedules, they will get back to you with some of the best ones. Okay, so we are past 7:30, and we've all got places to be. So let's wrap up the session by going to each of you with your favourite tree-related book. Who'd like to go first?
I think just ready for a big reveal. She's grabbing something.
I do. Okay, so I had a hard time because there's so many books that I love about trees. So I picked 2 from my shelf. I picked one by Algernon Blackwood. Ooh, I don't know if you can see that. It's called The Man Whom the Trees Loved. I love this story. It's so great. It's surprising. I will say that. And the other book I picked is called Tree Thieves, Crime and Survival in North America's Woods by Lindsay Borgen. And this is a story about the redwoods and all the poaching that happens. But it looks, I would say, a very human look at who's doing the poaching and why they're doing the poaching. a fantastic book. So those are just two of my favorites now, but I'm also going to read Nadina's book. So I'm excited about that. Yeah.
Thank you. And Tree Thieves is actually on my Christmas wish list. So that's cool. I'm glad I got this endorsement and I know that's great. I gave it away already a little bit in my presentation, but I think I'm going to choose, I don't have it on me, but Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv. Especially, entering this journey of motherhood is something that, all these things, I'm in the field, but having it in the way that he's written out there, and also all of these great suggestions that he has been really instrumental, not just in my own parenting philosophy, but also like convincing a lot of my other mom friends, right? It's like, I think it's something that you inherently, when you become a parent, you realize that your kid is so much happier when they're outside, right? I remember when he was really young and super fussy. If I could take him outside, it would just like melts all the problems away. Like, so it's something that I think we inherently feel and we see, but it's amazing how quickly we lose touch with that, and how quickly we accept, once he starts going off to school, what our schoolyards look like, right? These, they're not very yard-like at all, right? They're like asphalt covered places. And I'm really excited to become that mom that really goes hard at her kids' school and greening their schoolyards, because I think it's such an impactful place to do it, right? I always get the question in the urban nature space, well, what can I do, right? I only have a balcony, I can't have any impact. I don't have a backyard. Look at the places where you're spending the majority of your time. Often in cities, it's often not in your homes. It's actually at your workplace or at your church or at your kid's school. And think about these as places that you can actually have, meaningful, lasting interventions. So Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv.
I like that book too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. I haven't read any of those recommendations, so I've got some reading to do. And I can see in the chat that you've just sold a book. You've sold at least one of your Nature in Our Cities books, Nadina. So
wonderful. Yeah, I couldn't possibly say my own book. That felt a little too on the nose.
Okay. Oh, well, thank you again for agreeing to share your knowledge with us. That was absolutely fantastic, and all of the watchers and listeners agree. So, with that, I'm gonna let you go and let everybody else go. Thank you for a great webinar.
Thanks so much, Emma. Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
Good
thank
night.
you. Thank you.